wildfires and escalating wildfires due to climate change. I'm sure many of you have experienced directly or indirectly wildfires here in BC, if not other places around the world, and understand the importance of being able to both decrease or manage better the extent and intensity of these wildfires, and also to be able to adapt to those wildfires that we cannot control, that we cannot avoid. So I'm Sybil Seitsinger, the Executive Director of PICS, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. And I'd like to start though by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, which is where I'm located today, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wisanic peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. PICS is a collaboration across the 4 major research universities here in British Columbia. So it's a multi-university institute. So it has collaboration with University of Victoria, Simon Fraser University, the University of Northern British Columbia, and the University of British Columbia. Our mandate is to produce leading climate solutions research, but research that is actively used by decision makers to make more effective decisions on both adaptation and mitigation, decisions and policies. So today's event is very much in line with our mandate. PICS is delighted in this event to be partnering with the British Consulate-General in Vancouver in the lead up to the UNFCCC climate negotiations in Glasgow, which will start later this week, COP26. So at this point, again, I'd like to welcome you all, and I'd like to turn the floor over to Nicole Davidson, the British Consul-General, Vancouver. Nicole, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Sybil, and I'm delighted to join you today for this really important conversation. And I'm incredibly grateful for the work that we've had with the Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions on this event. It's a really important part of the conversation in the run-up to COP26, which, as Sybil said, starts later this week. So what I wanted to do, I have about 4 or 5 minutes or so, and just wanted to give you a very sort of high-level overview of COP itself and the level of ambition that the UK has set for COP, and just kind of put it in the context of what we're hoping will come out of COP. So, as I said, the UK has set a very high level of ambition for this particular COP. As we all know, we have reached an absolute inflection point where we are in terms of climate change. And as many of you who follow COP will know, the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a landmark in the global efforts to tackle climate change and represented a binding agreement bringing nations together in a common cause. But it was only the beginning of the road. And as I mentioned, the level of our ambition was high because we all know that not enough has happened since Paris. Emissions have continued to rise, and recently the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a code red for climate. And in short, they said that if we don't act now, that 1.5 degree limit will slip out of reach. So if Paris was about ambition, Glasgow needs to be about delivery. So in terms of COP, the United Kingdom, who has the chair of COP, is asking countries to deliver on 4 key goals. I just want to give you an overview of what those key goals are and what the sort of sub-goals of those look like. So the first is emissions reductions, securing global net zero by 2050 and keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. And in essence, what that means is accelerating the phase out of coal, curtailing deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles, and encouraging investment in renewables. The second goal is adapting to protect communities and natural habitats. And that is about protecting and restoring ecosystems. It's about building defenses, warning systems, resilient infrastructure, and agriculture to avoid the loss of homes, livelihoods, and in particular, lives. The third is about mobilizing finance, without which none of this can happen. So to deliver on our first 2 goals, developed countries must make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate finance per year. And international financial institutions must play their part, and we need to work towards unleashing trillions in private and public sector finance required to secure global net zero. The fourth goal is about working together. And that includes all of us working together to make the negotiations in Glasgow a success. It means finalizing the Paris rule book, which are the detailed rules that make the Paris Agreement operational. It's about accelerating action to tackle the climate crisis through collaboration between governments, businesses, and civil society. And I think one of the really important conversations in COP is how we all have an absolute part to play in this. Government can set targets, government can legislate, but businesses, academia, universities, individuals, societies, municipalities, all need to basically come together and do the right thing and step up and help us meet these challenges. So we've come quite a way in the last couple of years. In the last 2 years, well, 2 years ago, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. That figure is now 80% and rising. And most recently, both Turkey and the UAE have declared net zero targets. In fact, the UAE is the first country in the Gulf to do so, and we're hoping that others will still follow. And in the past 2 years, more than 70 countries have come forward with updated and more ambitious NDCs for 2030. That includes every G7 nation and some of the world's most climate vulnerable countries. But now what we want to see is that same level of ambition from the largest nations and from the G20 countries, who after all account for 80% of global emissions. And the thing is, legislation is one thing, but it's also, as I say, the action is incumbent upon all of us. And as we've seen in the example of Australia, fantastic that Australia has set targets, but now we need to see the legislation to follow as well. Particularly delighted that BC has updated its own roadmap, and we'll look forward to seeing how that ties into COP26 and climate ambition and where that takes us afterwards. But these are the kind of actions we need to be seeing, and we need to have legislation, but we need to have action as well. So in essence, I mentioned the 4 goals that we have for COP, but we want, in summary, we want this COP to be the one where coal power is consigned to history. We want it to be the COP which accelerates the drive to electric vehicles. We want it to be the COP that ends deforestation, and we want it to be the COP that reduces methane emissions. And all of those areas present opportunities in jobs and growth as well, so they make absolute sense financially, but they would make absolute sense from a climate change perspective as well. So going back to the Paris Agreement, analysis suggests that the commitments made then would have capped the rise in temperature to below 4 degrees. But we need to keep going much further than that to keep 1.5 within reach. And for that reason, Glasgow has to see a negotiated outcome that launches a decade of ever increasing ambition. So I hope that gives you an overview of the ambitions that we have set, the goals that we have set. These conversations are incredibly useful and incredibly important in terms of how do we take action to make that happen in important areas such as wildfires. So really looking forward to the conversation, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thanks so much, Nicole. My name's Carly Phillips, and I'm the researcher in residence for the Wildfire and Carbon Project at PICS. And I'm going to be your host and moderator today. I'd like to take a second to introduce you to each of our panelists, who are going to then do short presentations, followed by a panel discussion and then question and answers. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the question box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our first panelist today is Dr. Werner Kurtz, who's a Canadian research scientist at Canada's Pacific Forestry Centre in Victoria, British Columbia. Currently, his research focuses on managing forest land to maximize carbon efficiency and reducing the impact of natural disasters. He's made significant contributions to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the work of the IPCC, including contributions from Dr. Kurtz as well as other scientists, was recognized by the joint award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Werner, take it away with your presentation.
Thank you, Carly. And thanks to PICS for inviting me to this seminar and for the opportunity to present to you tonight. I will speak very briefly about wildfire and carbon emissions. And building on the presentation that we just heard from Nicole, I want to remind you of the IPCC's special report on climate on 1.5 degrees, in which it was made clear that in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to simultaneously reduce fossil fuel emissions and increase land sector sinks. And that means large, far-reaching transformations in all sectors of society. The IPCC has clearly identified that net zero and net negative emissions will be required. to halt global warming at any level. And in order to keep warming to below 2 degrees, we have to have larger land sector sinks, and that is one of the topics of tonight's presentations, is that forests are increasingly affected by the impacts of climate change, such as the wildfires that we have observed. As Nicole just presented, the Paris Agreement encouraged countries to submit commitments, so-called nationally determined contributions, to indicate how much they want to reduce their emissions and bring the world on a trajectory of global greenhouse gas emissions that is consistent with keeping temperatures well below 2 degrees centigrade. The Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change a few weeks ago published a report that made it very clear that collectively our national commitments fall far short of where we need to be to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, and that leading up to Glasgow, the pressure increased further that nations must increase their commitments. And of course, these commitments need to be achieved as we go forward. Trees play a very important role in the carbon cycle. Trees, the biomass, the weight of trees without water, the dry weight of trees is 50% carbon. And all of that carbon was removed from the atmosphere. In fact, trees and forests globally remove about 25 to 30% of all human-caused emissions. There are many opportunities for us to manage our forests and other land sector components differently to enhance land sector carbon sinks. Restoration of land, tree planting and afforestation, enhancing tree growth, avoiding land use conversion to non-forest land. That is the example of deforestation that Nicole gave a minute ago. Deforestation is not the harvest of trees, it's the conversion of forests to croplands or agricultural lands, etc. But while these opportunities exist, we also are faced with the risk from wildfires and the associated emissions. What we have seen in recent years is that climate change has greatly increased the area burned, as well as the severity of forest fires around the world, whether that is Australia or Siberia, Portugal or Greece, or Western North America, and even here in British Columbia. And future emissions from wildfires have the potential to be much larger than the benefits that we could achieve through some of the other natural climate solutions. So there's some real tension here in terms of what we can achieve through natural climate solutions and what the risks from wildfire emissions are. And to put this in perspective, the emissions from all other sectors in British Columbia combined are about 62 megatons per year at the moment. In the last 5 years, we observed the 3 largest area burnt events in the history of British Columbia and the recorded history of British Columbia. And on average, these 3 years released about 3 times the emissions in wildfires than all other sectors of British Columbia combined. So there is a significant mismatch in the magnitude of the things that we can do immediately by electrifying transportation or reducing emissions from fossil fuels within British Columbia if we don't also address wildfire emissions and the associated impacts on our ecosystems. We will be discussing possible solutions to this in the course of the evening, and I just wanted to show you this map, which is a summary by decade of the area burned by wildfires. And you see 2 things here. Clearly, recent decades had much larger area burned than in the past, in the recorded past. And there are clearly huge differences in the area burned across British Columbia. The seasonally dry interior forests have much higher area burned than some of the coastal and wetter areas. So clearly there is, when we consider ways to mitigate and adapt to wildfires, we need to consider the regional ecology, climate, and many other factors. How did we get here? There are a number of things that have happened in the last century that combined to get us to the point where we are today. The first is the exclusion of indigenous burning. European settlers have discouraged the use of traditional methods to manage the landscapes by indigenous people. And in the beginning of the 20th centuries, fire suppression became a very important tool as societies sought to protect timber values. In addition, forest management has favored conifers over less flammable hardwood species like aspen and birch. And as a consequence of all of these actions, and you can see an example of this in the photographs here, where the upper one is from 1936 and the lower from 2012, what these pictures show us is that a landscape that was heterogeneous in structure has become much more homogeneous with continuous coniferous forests spreading over vast areas. And when these conditions are ignited, we see the consequences in the mega fires of recent years. Climate change has made the situation worse because it has led to longer fire seasons, to higher temperatures, to more drought, and to more lightning ignitions. In fact, the number of fires due to lightning has greatly increased in recent years. So what can we do to go forward? First of all, there's no simple solution. We need regionally differentiated approaches, and we need to look at how we can implement landscape level transitions from the current conditions to more fire resilient conditions. These will include a number of actions, such as reducing the fuel load, changing the vertical structure of fuels. The exclusion of fires has allowed young trees to regenerate after below the larger conifers, and that has led to vertical continuity of fuel. So when the fire is brought in, ignites, it will carry into the canopy, killing the whole stand. We need to increase the fire breaks and introduce more grassland openings, more shrubby openings where we don't have continuous crown fires. We need to encourage the presence of hardwoods and other less flammable tree species. And we need to reintroduce fire, both as prescribed fire, as was used by the indigenous populations, but also by modifying our fire suppression and allowing wildfires under conditions that are not as extreme where that is possible. But there are also other ways to deal with this issue, such as removing through thinning some of the smaller trees, some of the biomass that has accumulated, and find ways to use this biomass in a bioeconomy so as to not burn it and not create the emissions and the smoke that are so adverse in terms of human health impacts. We need to reduce both the emissions and smoke, but we need to be clear that they cannot be eliminated from our landscapes. Therefore, we need to prepare communities and the wildland-urban interface for the inevitable fires that we will continue to see in the future. And we must recognize that this is a multi-generational commitment that will require large investments over time. The PICS Wildfire and Carbon Project is a collaborative effort among many universities, the US Forest Service, the Parks Canada, and British Columbia government to address questions of how we can reduce future wildfire emissions and strengthen BC's forest-based bioeconomy, for example, by removing some of the wood from forests to reduce fuel loads and use these in engineered wood products, building insulation, bioenergy, or for other novel bioproducts. The goal is to combine mitigation and adaptation strategies to increase the resilience of our forested landscapes. So despite climate change impacts, BC's forest sector offers opportunities to enhance sinks and contribute to net negative emissions, and we need to identify and implement these whenever possible. The climate change impacts on BC forests are projected to further increase, and therefore future wildfire area burned and emissions are projected to increase unless we act. Unless we act now to reduce future wildfire emissions through mitigation and adaptation activities. Most importantly, however, none of this can achieve success if we don't also greatly reduce fossil fuel emissions rapidly, because land sector sinks alone cannot solve the climate problem. Thank you very much, and back to you, Carly.
Great. Thanks so much, Werner, for that fascinating presentation. That really sets the stage for the conversation that we are about to have. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Kira Hoffman. She's a fire ecologist and former wildland firefighter. Currently, she's jointly appointed as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia and the Bulkley Valley Research Center. Her work focuses on how present-day forests have been shaped by stewardship techniques like burning, and how ongoing fire suppression has eroded the resiliency of fire-adapted landscapes. She received her bachelor's degree in geography and her PhD in ecology from the University of Victoria. Over to you, Kira.
Great, thank you. And maybe I'll just quickly screen share so that, oh, here we go. I'll just start my video so everyone can see me. Okay, so thanks. I'm going to talk about a few of the trends in wildfire suppression and containment in British Columbia, as well as talk about some of the contributing factors that have led to increased fire severity in recent years. I'm going to add on a lot of what Werner talked about regarding some of the conditions that have made British Columbia forests less resistant and resilient to wildfire. Okay. Okay, so British Columbia is a fire-dependent landscape. So fire has been and continues to be a healthy component of functioning ecosystems. It is good for biodiversity, it's good for ecosystem services, and it is good for communities as Indigenous people have had relationships with fire that have been beneficial to the environment and to healthy and functioning communities for millions of years. When settlers first arrived on Vancouver Island, they would have come across these prairie landscapes and not realized that they were fire maintained through Indigenous fire stewardship systems. And as we move forward into the 20th century, we enter into this era of wildfire suppression. So British Columbia is a province with full suppression and containment policies. This is starting to shift as we move towards modified response or letting some fires burn when the conditions are not conducive to severe wildfire spread. But overall, 100 years of fire suppression has led to an accumulation of dead and dry material in forests. And those conditions combined with a warmer and drier climate are creating a situation where we have very difficult decisions to make, a fire triage, where we want to shift to more modified response, but in some wildfire seasons, like in 2021, we can't, or we're being forced to decide which fires we choose to suppress. 2017, and as many people know in British Columbia, was the worst fire season in 100 years. Only to be surpassed by 2018 as the worst fire season in 100 years. 2021 comes up as the third largest area burned on record. It will be the most expensive wildfire season British Columbia has ever experienced, and that is directly related to major losses of communities, livelihoods, and direct fatalities as a result of the loss of the community of Lytton. The general trend in ignitions is that it's actually decreasing over the last 30 years, but the annual area burned is increasing. So we have larger fires and fewer fire events, but larger fires that are contributing to the area burned. So 2017 and 2018, the amount of area that was impacted by wildfire is the size of Vancouver Island. So that combined, to put that into perspective, these are huge footprints on the land base, and we're starting to see, as fires encroach into southern areas as well, larger fires where we would have previously had lower severity fire activity. We're also starting to see fires, Werner talked about the mega fire. These are unsuppressible or uncontrollable wildfires. We see fires that are greater than 100,000 hectares. In 2017 and 2018, we have fires that are greater than 500,000 hectares. These are single fire events. And so again, the impacts of these are very serious and very concerning, especially because a lot of places that would maybe not have burned in the past or would have been areas of fire exclusion are now undergoing severe fire activity. One thing that is occurring is that wildfires are disproportionately affecting Indigenous communities. Wildfires are occurring in forested areas and remote communities, even when they are doing wildfire mitigation techniques and fuel removal, are not being able to actually stop wildfires from entering their communities. And so the scale of how we do fuel mitigation has to change to reflect the scale of the wildfires that we're experiencing. Again, getting into a situation where it's very difficult to decide what fires need to be put out, and scrambling sometimes to protect communities and then losing really important habitat values or very critical ecosystems that are important to species at risk. Wildfire is becoming incredibly expensive, and increasing the amount of heavy machinery or aircraft or personnel is still not meeting what is needed in order to have a better relationship with fire. We're always going to need fire suppression, but we need to consider that we need to think about wildfire potentially as a year-round management and decision-making process. So prescribed burning, Indigenous fire stewardship are two really, really important things that can be done right away to mitigate the impacts of wildfire. When done under the right conditions and by the right people with the right experience, these wildfires can help protect communities, and they can also keep forests intact. So, we're not cleaning out whole forests. We are keeping the larger trees. A lot of people have concerns that a lot of areas will just be kind of mowed down and then burned. That's not what we're talking about here. And I think that there needs to be better communication on what controlled fire means and what it can look like in British Columbia. And so there is many people who have, place-based knowledge and fire practitioners who have the experience to help us create better ways of living with fire or putting more fire on the land base. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kira. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Angela Yao. She's a regional epidemiologist at BC's Observatory for Population and Public Health and an adjunct professor at UBC's School of Population and Public Health. She's interested in modeling environmental exposures and assessing their population health impacts using novel data sources, especially climate change related exposures like extreme heat events and wildfire smoke. Her PhD looked at the acute health effects of sub-daily exposure to wildfire smoke. And she earned both a master's degree in environmental health and a PhD in population and public health from the University of British Columbia. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kali. And thank you very much for the presentations from Kira and Werner. They really provided a very good background story for what I'm going to say today. And I'm going to talk about the public health impact of wildfire smoke. Here you can see a picture of Williams Lake on July 30th, 2017. And as you can see, it's all smoked up and it's like night during a day. While wildfires can be a direct threat to our life and properties, it is the smoke that emitted from wildfires that can actually reach for a much larger populations well beyond those who were close to the fire. Here you can see that this is a satellite image on the same day as the picture that you saw just now in Williams Lake. And you can see that the smoke got dispersed well beyond Williams Lake and just spread across the entire province. And wildfire smoke can cause some of the worst air quality most Canadians ever experience. This is a picture of Vancouver on a regular day versus on the day July 5th, 2015. And the PM 2.5, which is fine particulate matter in the atmosphere, on that day in Vancouver was almost 10 times of the regular concentrations. And I remember that the fires in 2015 was the first time in the Lower Mainland that we really can tell and can see very apparent impact of wildfire smoke. But wildfire smoke actually has been impacting communities closer to fires in the interior for a very long time, well before that. Fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, that I was just introduced, is commonly used as a proxy for wildfire smoke because the actual wildfire smoke is a very complex mixture of different gases and particles, and the mixture can be very different during different fires and even during different phases of the same fire. PM 2.5 is a really small particles that can get very deep into our lung and get into our system. So that's which can cause a wide range of different health impacts. There has been more and more studies on the health impact from wildfire smoke. They can be simply irritation of our eyes, throat, and there has been very sufficient evidence on its impact on worsening pre-existing conditions. For example, there has been observations of increased health outcomes related to asthma, ranging from increased medication dispensations, physician visits, hospitalizations, and even deaths. There has also been evidence accumulating on its impact on worsening heart conditions, such as heart attacks and stroke. And there is also some pretty new evidence on its impact on worsening diabetic conditions, as well as birth outcomes such as lower birth weight, and a very new paper on its increased on preterm birth. There has also been some new evidence on its possible impact on the decline of cognitive functions following exposure. And this is something from my PhD thesis, where I looked at the very acute health effect of wildfire smoke following exposure, measured by in the time scale of hours. And this figure shows the odds ratio as the y-axis and hours as the x-axis. The only one thing that you keep in mind is that an odds ratio over 1 indicates increased risk of this particular health outcome. So we can see for both, and here we're talking about ambulance dispatches for breathing problems and ischemic heart disease. And you can see that there was increased risk of this ambulance dispatch for breathing problems and heart disease, at the very beginning, right following the exposure. And the impact was largest at the very first hour following exposure. So this finding has really highlighted the importance of us being prepared, both as individual and as a society, recognizing that wildfires are here to stay, and smoke is here to stay as well. And what the key thing that we need to do is just be well prepared, well ahead of time before the wildfire season, and do whatever we can to reduce our exposure. And I'm sure we'll have a bit more time to discuss this later in the discussion. And I'll stop here now.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. I'm really excited to have all three of you here in conversation this evening. I think that the perspectives that you bring about the impact of wildfires on ecosystems, on communities, on public health, and on the carbon balance are going to be really important in framing the wildfire challenge, but also the opportunity that we may have to intervene. And so I want to kick off our discussion by talking about the 2021 wildfire season, which, as several of you mentioned, we saw the third most burned area on record for BC. Thousands of people were under evacuation orders, and we saw a tragedy unfold in Lytton following the extreme heat event in late June. And given your specific perspectives and the expertise and experience that you're bringing, I'm really interested in what stuck out to you this season. What were you paying attention to that the general public might not be paying attention to when they're seeing a fire season and these wildfires spread across our landscape? Kira, can you kick us off? What were your impressions? What were you looking at?
Sure. So I think that the biggest thing that struck me was the 50 degrees Celsius temperatures in Lytton in June. It was a real warning to me, and it made me very, very nervous. You know, my experience in firefighting and suppression, and being a fire ecologist, I was just kind of waiting for something to happen. And of course it did a few days later. And I think that the aggressive fire behavior surprised me. I didn't think that people wouldn't, I thought that people would have more time. The village of Lytton was consumed in a matter of 15 minutes. And it was very frightening, I think. And I think that a lot of the public felt that way. I think that scientists felt that way. And I think just alarm bells were going off in my head, thinking about the trauma, thinking about the stress related with evacuations, the stress of being a first responder in those situations. And so, just a general feeling of sadness is what stood out to me for 2021.
Yeah, that really resonates with me and the experience that I had as well, as I imagine it does for lots of folks who are tuning in today. Werner, I'm interested in your perspective. What stuck out to you? What are you still thinking about following this fire season?
Thanks, Carly. Two things stood out. One is the scientists in our field have been predicting for decades that extreme events will increase, and we have all heard about 100-year flood events, 100-year drought events, occurring multiple times in a decade. I think we have just seen an extreme example of this. We had the two most severe fire years on record in 17 and 18, and then in 19 and 20, we had very little area burned in British Columbia. Fortunately, we had massive fires just south of the border in Washington and Oregon and California in 2020 and in Alberta. But we were lucky in British Columbia in that year for a variety of reasons. So these extreme interannual variability in the occurrence of multiple very extreme events in short succession means that we are likely on a trajectory of more of that in the future, as predicted by the science community. The second part, and the one that hasn't really made it in the media, is that the heat dome that we experienced in the summer of 2021, temperatures approaching almost 50 degrees centigrade, will have had massive impacts on plants and trees in particular. The drought stress that was associated with that, the possibility that the water column within the tree would break and we get basically airlocks that will increase the drought stress of the trees in the future. Those are all things for which we will see the consequences in the coming years. So one thing that I will be watching for with my community of ecologists and scientists is whether the extreme events that we just witnessed had secondary impacts on tree mortality over large areas, which is again consistent with predictions of climate change, that extreme events will cause increased mortality. And that's of course a vicious cycle, because then we will have lots of dead organic matter, dead trees that become fuel for future wildfires. So those are the two things that really stood out for me for 2021.
Thanks, Werner. Yeah, I think you raise an important point about the legacy of these events. It's not a one-off. It's not just a single summer. There are long-term impacts to these things, ecologically, for communities, kind of across the board. What were you paying attention to, Angela?
I think there are also two things. One is the incredible challenges that we are facing this summer when we need to deal with multiple environmental hazards at the same time, or like hazards at the same time generally. So we have heat dome and we have wildfire smoke, and we also have the pandemic that's moving around. And it really challenged our way to deal with these hazards at the same time, because sometimes the solutions can be conflicting with each other for these different types of hazards. And some of the usual interventions that we use, such as like clean air shelters, or advising people to go to the malls and have cleaner air, seek cleaner air, it's a bit it's harder during the pandemic. And so that's one thing that's kind of special this year. And secondly, I think it's just the prolonged period of exposure in the interior of BC. So we're talking about very little relief over almost 2 months period of smoke in the interior. And I think this kind of exposure is increasingly common during summer when there is a fire. There is fire activities in the province. And one kind of happier surprise for me is that how lucky the half of the population that live in Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island, where it could have been a lot worse for this part of the population this summer, given how much fire we are surrounded by. But it was incredibly lucky that we only had a very short episode of impact of smoke due to the meteorology conditions. So it's just about 1 week of exposure. So I say we try to find the positive from all the negative. Yeah, and that I think that's my impression.
Yeah, and that really relates to Werner's point about the legacy of this, right? Wildfires, the impacts aren't felt necessarily in just the place where those fires are burning, but across the board, across the continent, as the smoke travels and impacts lots and lots of other folks. So thank you for that. I'd like to shift our conversation to how we got here. How are we in this place where these extreme wildfires that are burning large areas are our reality? Like both Werner and Kira said, 3 of the past 5 years have been the worst on record in terms of burned area in British Columbia. I know that we've talked a little bit in your presentations about fire suppression and about climate change. But I'd like to unpack that a little bit so we can have an understanding of the processes that are really driving that. So Kira, can you expand a little bit more on the history of wildfires in BC and specifically how our landscapes have changed to become more or less fire prone in the past 100 years or so?
Sure. So, I mentioned that British Columbia is a fire dependent landscape. There would have been a lot of fire in British Columbia prior to colonization. And so there would have been a lot of low severity, mixed severity fire events. So low severity ground fires that would have maintained grasslands. There would have been a lot of open grasslands and open forests. Of course, there would have been high severity fire events. That's natural. That's part of wildfire in the subboreal and boreal forests. But for the most part, fires would have burned and then ran into another fire perimeter of a historic burn and snuffed itself out. And so again, just kind of echoing Werner's point about landscape heterogeneity, how important it is to have these different patches of landscape with different fire histories. And so it's difficult to understand. One thing we really try and do is reconstruct the amount of wildfire prior to fire suppression. And generally what we see is that there has been just a lot of fire and a lot of low severity fire. Those are cultural burning and lightning ignited fires. And then right around 1920, 1930, we again begin the era of fire suppression. And what this means is those fires that again would have cleaned out that forest are not happening. And so this buildup of fuels, you also get into the era of forestry. And so you have a greater homogeneous landscape with plantations. When those plantations grow up, they are less resilient to wildfire because they, again, lacking deciduous species, we clear those out. They're all the same age. They're very susceptible to things like mountain pine beetle, to wind events, to diseases. And so, they're also very densely packed. And so fire can move through them really quickly. Again, it's very ecosystem dependent, but for the most part, there's also abundance of slash on the ground as we've really scaled back broadcast burning as a silviculture treatment. And so there is an abundance of fuel, and that is, coupled with, again, warmer and drier conditions, which are creating longer fire seasons. It's kind of this perfect storm for having these very, very large and severe wildfire events. And so I think an important thing is to remember that cultural fire suppression is still very much in play. There's a lot of desire and push for the revitalization of Indigenous-led fire stewardship. And that's slowly, one thing that's happening in 2021 is there is, a real push for that. And I think that people are becoming more aware of it and, understanding what those mean and what it can mean for British Columbia. But there's a real need to support, fire across the broader landscape, and Indigenous-led cultural burning is a huge way to do that.
Yeah, I want to follow up briefly on something that you mentioned there, Kira. You talked about reconstructing fire histories. Can you talk briefly about how that works? How are we able to know what burned in the past?
Yes, tree ring science is the best out there. Trees are like big, climate markers or thermometers, and they can tell you exactly, the season sometimes when a fire burned. I just happen to have one. So this is a white bark pine. I hope everyone can see it. It's got a beautiful fire scar in it that burned in 1920. And then after that, there's no fires. And so this is collected in North Tweedsmuir. So there's usually just a stamp, a fire suppression stamp. And that's, this is likely cultural burning. But they're embedded in these fire scars on these trees. And so you can tell the exact time when a fire occurred. And because the severity, because the tree survives the fire and then continues to grow. So there's really amazing records. People have developed, 1,000-year records of burning, that the pattern there is very, very strong, and that it just ceases right around the beginning of the 20th century.
Thank you for that. And I'm so glad you had that prop on hand. It's great to
Unrehearsed.
see. Unrehearsed, truly though. Truly unrehearsed. Well, and Werner, so I have a question for you based on something that Kira brought up. She talked about how densely packed our landscapes are now, how much more biomass is there. So from a carbon perspective, it seems like our landscapes are storing more carbon as a result. And when I think about natural climate solutions, a lot of that has to do with continuing to store carbon on our landscapes, but it still seems in conflict with fire risk. So can you unpack that relationship for us a little bit between the carbon stocks on landscapes, fire risk, and how we might move forward with natural climate solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key thing is that when we talk about natural climate solutions, we're asking questions about how can we increase the rate at which forests remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's the sink strength, so the rate at which carbon is taken up, as opposed to how much carbon is stored. It's a little bit like, the capital you have in your bank account is the amount of stock, the interest rate that is being paid on it, and the rate of return that you get is your sink. If you want, that's what increases the stock. The problem that we have faced is that over the last century, as Kira was outlining, and as we see in many data, the amount of fuels and biomass, and therefore carbon, in our landscapes has increased, particularly in those landscapes where there has been no harvesting, and well over half of the area of British Columbia is non-timber harvest land base. So in those areas, and even in some areas where we are harvesting, we see increases in carbon stocks. And as a consequence, as we all know, if we have ever enjoyed a campfire while camping, burning wood releases a lot of energy, and that's because wood is basically stored energy from the sun, and so we have basically created a landscape that has more carbon and more energy stored that is probably compatible with the pressures of climate change, and that means the likelihood that we can add more carbon to the landscape is probably relatively small. And we see that in some of our national parks across Canada, particularly in Western Canada, where we haven't harvested in over a century, and yet the ability of these forests to take up more carbon is nil, because they release through wildfires and insects just as much or more than they have taken up. So strictly a conservation-based approach is not a way to enhance and maintain forest carbon sinks, as the IPCC is calling for and the international community is calling for. So the question then is, how can we manage our forests to reduce wildfire risk, to maintain these forests as carbon sinks, and to reduce the emissions from wildfires? And one solution to this, and again, regionally differentiated, depends on many different factors, including the wildfire risk, but one solution is to basically make sure some of the biomass of these forests is removed through thinning and through other methods. And we encourage the regrowth of fire-resistant species. Conifers are not excluded from that. A large Douglas fir can withstand fire quite well, particularly if it doesn't get into the crown. And so there are a number of things that we need to collectively explore, and that's what we're doing in this PICS project, about ways in which we can increase the resilience of the landscapes so that they can continue to function as carbon sinks and play this very important role of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That involves, every now and then, removing some of that carbon from the ecosystem and using it elsewhere, like in buildings or in other novel bioproducts, et cetera, but allowing the forest then to regrow. And this will be a long discussion with many stakeholders, lots of scientific analyses about where this works and where this doesn't work. We don't have time tonight to go into all of this, but our team and the PICS partners in this project have been working on these questions for a decade or more, and there are many, many scientific publications, references to which you can find on the PICS website of the project.
Thanks, Werner. And I think that really frames the idea of carbon storage a little differently, and carbon sinks especially, than maybe it has been in other conversations. So I really appreciate that perspective. I want to talk about climate change a little bit. We're talking about the mitigation potential of forests, but I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on what we can expect to see in future fire seasons. What are we going to be seeing as climate impacts become more fully experienced across the province? What's that going to look like?
Well, maybe I start since I'm on the screen right now. Basically, after the 2017 wildfire season, everybody was shocked, and there was a report released that highlighted and introduced the problem by saying this is the new normal. Very unfortunately, this is a bad analogy. What we're facing is not the new normal, because climate change is not going to stay where it was in 2017 or 18. All the projections are for warmer seasons, more drought, hotter temperatures, more lightning ignitions. So we're not facing a new normal. We're on a continuous upward trend of more severe wildfire conditions, risk of more area burned. And so we really need to look at the remaining adaptation and mitigation strategies to bend that curve of increasing area burned and bring us towards conditions that are more conducive with future climate impacts and forcings of wildfires.
Yeah, I think in terms of the public health impact, with the changes in all the wildfire activities, there's also change in its missions and how the smoke is going to behave and how it impacts our air quality and subsequently our health. So for example, as wildfires are a lot more severe, intense now compared to what Kira was saying, that at the period where it was all low intensity or low severity fires. And when fires gets more intense, it tends to inject the smoke a lot higher to the atmosphere, which will lead to more likely to be transported to longer distance from the fire itself. So that's also that will mean that even larger population would be impacted by wildfire and with more frequency as well. So I remember my mentor, Dr. Sarah Henderson, started studying wildfire smoke impact and in BC 20 years ago on the 2003 Okanagan fire, which was already unprecedented at that time in BC. But she has to limit the study to only include southern interior of the province, because that's because mostly the health impact was quite localized to that area. But as time goes by, to the time that I started to study this topic, and then in the recent 10 years, we're really noticing more and more impact across the entire province. And also BC are getting smoke from elsewhere pretty regularly. We're getting smoke from California, from Washington, from Alberta, and even from Siberia. And it's happening pretty regularly now. So I think that would likely continue into the future, and that's what we just have to adapt to this not new normal, but maybe worsening conditions.
Definitely. Thank you for that perspective. Kira, what do you have to add?
Maybe I'll just add that I think that we can expect some yo-yoing to occur, much like we saw in 2019 and 2020, and really take the opportunity to engage in modified response during those times. You know, when we're working with very low to moderate fire weather, that we can decide, let's let this fire burn. It's not impacting communities, it's not impacting values, and just making those decisions is going to be very difficult, but it's a definite step forward. And then we're creating a landscape that is more fire resilient, and the plants that come back are going to be better able to withstand future fire. You know, if we are, again, continuing to kind of get into this wildfire suppression trap where we keep putting out small fires, eventually, again, we will have these large fires that are uncontrollable, and it won't matter what you try and throw at it. You won't stop them. And so I think that really taking the opportunity to realize the kind of situation you're in and then making the plan to meet the, you know, conditions is really key.
Yeah, I want to follow up on something you mentioned there and have mentioned in a few of your responses, the aspect of fire weather and how that plays into it. You talked about, you know, under these low fire weather conditions that we should let those fires burn. Can you talk about how fire weather can affect fire behavior and how a fire is going to move across the landscape?
Sure. So there's different indices that are based on vegetation. And so you have drought codes, and they can tell you about the dryness of the fuels. And so what is the probability of a, you know, a certain size of fuel combusting under different conditions. And so, you know, these things are good predictors of how a fire will burn, and then how you should respond to it. And so it can tell you the type of fire behavior you're going to experience. Those fuel characteristics are still in process and in the works in British Columbia, but we do have a pretty good idea, you know, when the temperature is this and the winds are doing this and the relative humidity is this, you know, what we should expect based on the previous, you know, 2 weeks of precipitation, for example. So there is a formula that can tell you kind of how fire will burn in a certain fuel type. And that's really key into understanding how it will affect different values and spread through different fuel types.
Great, thank you for that additional context and information. I want to bring in a few questions that have been posted in the chat box. A couple of folks have asked about the recording for the presentation, and it will be available on the PICS website, so you can look for that there. If your Wi-Fi cut out or if you had to step away, you will have an opportunity to, you know, view the rest of the webinar, excuse me. One question that, sorry, you are all asking great questions, so I've got to do some scrolling in order to see the correct ones. There was a question about the strategy of thinning. So what does thinning mean? This one was directed to you, Werner. Is it cutting? Is it clear cutting? If it's not clear cutting, how is it different from that? Can you explain a little bit that strategy for fuel management in more detail?
Yeah, thinning is in silviculture referred to as a form of partial cutting, which means what you're doing is you're trying to remove some trees but leave behind others. And it could be done in order to achieve certain silvicultural objectives. But what we're talking about here in terms of fire and fuel reduction is we're trying to create stand conditions that are more capable to withstand light and moderate severe wildfires. And so basically, I talked earlier about the vertical structure of forests. So if, as a consequence of fire suppression, we don't have ground fires, the seedlings on the ground amidst the small leaves and branches that are on the ground will start grow bigger, and eventually we will get a vertically, you know, multi-layered forest stand. And when a ground fire burns in that stand, what you end up doing is the small trees start burning, they carry the flames up, and eventually they reach the canopy, and then the fire traverses through the whole canopy, burning the stand. Those are so-called crown fires. And trees in our, you know, unlike eucalypts in Australia, which can survive ground fires, our conifers and hardwood species typically die as a result of crown fires. And so the question is, you know, the Kira was talking about First Nations burning and the history of landscape burning, and we may have seen pictures of the, you know, early 1900s of forests that were quite open in the understory, but had a small number of very large trees present. Those large trees with thick bark tend to be very resilient to wildfire. And so we have a moderate amount of carbon stored in the forest, but we have ongoing storage through the large trees that are removing some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So and she also talked about the plantations or the young forests that regenerate after disturbances. Transitioning these young forests and dense forests to more open forests and more fire resistant forests is one objective of thinning. The problem with those things is that they cost money, because what we're taking out are not the highly valuable large trees. We're taking out smaller diameter trees and biomass and things that are typically considered fuels. And so here's the part of the challenge. We need to combine strategies to manage our forests with a market for the product that can turn this into a revenue or a carbon store or into something that we can use to substitute for other emissions like fossil fuels, et cetera. And so thinning is not clear cutting. Thinning could be done from above or below for various different reasons, but for fire fuel reductions, it's thinning from below, where you try to create stand conditions that are more resilient to wildfire. And in doing so, you get small amounts of biomass or large amounts of biomass that you can then turn into products.
Great, thank you for that, Werner. That's a great example of one of the strategies that we can use on a landscape scale when we're thinking about wildfire risk mitigation. If we want to zoom in a little bit more, I'm interested in discussing solutions on a community level. What are the things that we can do to protect our communities from wildfire and help make them more resilient to these increasing risks? Kira, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So I think that the first step, just as a homeowner or a community member, is to understand what the wildfire strategy is for your community and how you can better prepare your property. You can use the Fire Smart program. There's the Indigenous Fire Smart booklet. And these are designed to help people reduce fuels on their property, create more fire smart options like a metal roof, for example. Clearing trees, moving firewood away from your home, reducing brush, etc. Those are things that you can immediately do. From a larger community perspective, it's really, really good to know your evacuation routes and have a plan to evacuate. I think that you should never expect someone to come and knock on your door. You should always assume that communications are down, etc., and have a discussion with your friends or family members about what you would do in a wildfire, and how you would respond, and making sure that you can leave your home safely. On a landscape scale, I think it's really important to buffer communities against wildfires, but it's problematic right now because doing things like reducing fuels around communities and engaging in prescribed fire is just one part, but it has to be on a broader landscape basis or across territories, because the scale of the wildfires coming again need to be met with a scale of mitigation that's going to buffer it or slow it down at least. And so some of the buffers around communities I've seen, are a few hundred meters. And I think we just need to be more realistic about wildfires, and their spotting potential, their behavior in the future, and start creating responses and preparations that are really able to meet again or slow down wildfires as they approach communities.
Great, thank you for that. I want to zoom in even further when we're thinking about solutions to the individual level. Angela, can you help us understand how we can protect our lungs, the lungs of our family, and the health of our communities in that really direct way?
Yeah, so I think from the community level, the most important thing is to the awareness and to recognize that this is here to stay and we have to deal with it long term. That means that communities need to, and municipalities and public health officials, different organizations, they need to have a detailed plan on what all the actions that they need to take when there's wildfire and there's wildfire smoke coming into their community well ahead of the wildfire season starts. For example, things like when to cancel a large event due to smoke, or how to set up clean air shelter, where to set it up, and say having a program where vulnerable individuals in the community can actually rent an air cleaner to be used at their homes and things like that. So plans that can be acted on during wildfire seasons. And also long-term, say, what should we do with our HVAC system in our buildings and in our healthcare facilities, our commercial buildings, to make it suitable when we need to have air filtration during wildfire smoke impacts. And then on a more individual level, it's also about preparedness. So first is that you need to know where to get the correct, the accurate information about smoke and about its potential impact and the forecast of smoke impact in your community. And there is a website at the BC CDC as well as Environment Canada, where you have forecasted smoke forecasting model, where you can see where the smoke is going in the next 24 or 48 hours, which would give you a little bit lead time to get prepared. And then it's also you can check out the air quality health index, where it is indication of the air quality in your area, and adjust your activity based on those information. And then plan to create a clean air room at your own home. That's probably one of the best thing we can do as an individual when dealing with wildfire smoke. It has been proven that air cleaner with HEPA filter is highly effective in removing smoke from the air at your home when it is used appropriately. And so if you have the means, the commercially available portable air cleaners are a good investment to have. And the BC CDC also did some experiment and testing on some DIY air cleaners, which used a box fan in combination with some HEPA filters, which also from the results, it's pretty effective as well if you use in a small room with your doors and windows closed. So that's some of the ways to create a clean air environment at your own home, which will likely reduce exposure and subsequently reduce the possible impact from the exposure. So these are all the things that can be done.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm hearing from all of you that preparation is key here. Preparation for our landscapes, preparation for our communities, preparation of our homes. And so I appreciate, the consistency of that message. That's helpful when thinking about what we need to do to take care of ourselves. I want to turn to some questions that have come through in the chat. We've got one here for Kira. Can you elaborate on differences in cultural burning practices by people living on the coast as compared to the interior, for example? Can you provide any information about that, Kira?
Sure. I mean, I think that the big thing is that cultural burning is very community specific. And so it really differs between communities occupying the same ecosystem type. Or there might be similarities between dry and wet ecosystems as well. It really depends on, practices and traditions of burning, knowledge bases, and what is the primary diet usually of indigenous communities. So some of our research that we just did looked at how communities that have caribou as a primary diet, they use fire a lot less than communities who primarily hunt moose, because moose like open landscapes, early successional landscapes that are, have a lot of fire compared to caribou that like to have older trees with lichen that they eat. And so I just want to, really say that it is very specific, and that those teachings, shouldn't be taken out of communities, and that, they are held within communities for specific reasons.
Thank you for that. Staying on the theme of intentional burning, and the way that that might be a solution when we're thinking about adapting and mitigating wildfires. We have a question about the carbon consequences of something like intentional burning. Is there quantitative information on the reduction in carbon emissions when using prescribed burns compared to what's released during wildfires? Werner, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, but that's a really good question. And I would like to take it a little bit beyond just the comparison between prescribed fire emissions and wildfire emissions, and go even further and say, we know that there is too much fuel on the landscape right now. We discussed the reasons for that. We know that this amount of fuel is incompatible with climate change, and so we need to develop pathways towards reduced wildfire emissions, just like we need to societally develop pathways towards net zero and net negative emissions. Wildfire emissions play a role in that. And so what the PICS Wildfire and Carbon Project is trying to do is quantify exactly what some of these options are. We talked about pathways that involve thinning or reduced, and use of biomass for bioproducts or bioenergy, prescribed fires that are used where other options are not available, and allow to reduce the wildfire risks in the future. So the tools and models that we have developed allow us to quantify the consequences of these different mitigation actions that could be implemented in the landscape. And we can very clearly demonstrate which of these are better than others. I just give you one example. If we can use a tree in a mass timber building, we have the carbon retained for many years into the future, and we avoid the use of emissions intensive materials like steel and concrete. Clearly, that is much better for the atmosphere than using that carbon in the same tree and turning it into biofuel, which has a lower substitution benefit and will be releasing the carbon back as soon as that biofuel is burned. So our team is looking at options in the ecosystems and in the use of wood products that deliver better greenhouse gas mitigation benefits. Where the real challenge for the fire science community is at the moment is to translate changes in landscape characteristics into the outcomes in terms of future area burned and future wildfire emissions. And that is in part because it is so difficult to predict, as Kira indicated, what the future conditions will be for these wildfires. What we know is that there will be extreme fire years and less severe fire years, but it's really hard to predict right now how that probability distribution of extreme events will shift as we go into the future, and how the modifications that we're proposing to do are going to reduce wildfire risks. So the ongoing research is really focused on trying to understand how the future wildfire emissions will change in response to climate change impacts like tree mortality that I talked about earlier, future insects, future management actions, and the use of prescribed fires and modified wildfires. So those are questions that we need to answer. These are not research questions that will be answered overnight. This is a long journey that we need to embark on as a society as we try to develop pathways to net zero.
Thank you for that additional context on prescribed fires. I want to turn to Angela now and ask about the smoke consequences of prescribed fire versus wildfire. Do we know anything about how those are different in terms of their smoke impacts and the impacts they'll have on public health?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's of interest of a lot of people. And I guess the short answer is that we don't know for sure, and we don't know the full picture, as it is a very, very complex question to compare the two. And there are some studies to try to look at the different composition of smoke from these two different types of burning. But the results are not always the same. As I said, it's like the smoke from the same fire can be different at different phases and different stages. So it's really inconclusive how exactly they are different. But for prescribed burns, it tends to be lower intensity and burn at a different condition, because it's usually chosen at a condition where it's more likely to be controlled, right? So in that condition, it usually lead to more localized impact of smoke. Compared to wildfire, which it gets really intense and it can impact has a more global, regional and global impact of smoke. So we're talking about probably two different communities that are getting the impact from smoke as a result of these two types of burns. And also when you have prescribed burns, it's usually, correct me if I'm wrong, Kira and Werner, is usually mostly in the most shoulder season. So that the atmospheric condition can be quite different compared to when wildfires are happening during the very hot summer. And at the shoulder seasons, you're more likely to see inversion happening. So that can sometimes create even more, the smoke got trapped at the location where it has more local impact as well. So that's that. And also I think when you want to compare the health impact of prescribed burn and wildfires, you can't really just compare a single event. You have to compare it as, when we say fire regime, we will have to say smoke regime. You're talking about multiple events of prescribed burns and multiple events of wildfire, which one ended up producing more health impact, which can be a very complex question again, because you need to account for the emission itself, and also how much wildfires can be prevented by a certain prescribed, like the amount of prescribed burn. And also that because the health impacts are maybe a burden to different communities, then you will also need to consider the different vulnerability in these two different communities. And I guess another point that I have is that one challenge might be to have prescribed burns is the different risk perception from people about its health impact. So people tend to be more accepting of impact from wildfires because they are considered natural and inevitable. But if it's something that's man-made, then people tend to perceive it as more impactful and perceive it as more less likely to accept it. So that's another dimension where good communication and a lot of communication needs to happen there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Angela. Before we wrap up our webinar this evening, I want to give Kira a quick chance to talk about some of the other costs of prescribed burning, in addition to the health impacts that Angela just outlined.
Yeah, Angela just outlined that really well, actually. It's a perfect setting for more research. But I just want to say that a lot of new studies are coming out in the Western US, and it's generally, the numbers are there that it's about $800 to directly suppress an acre in a wildfire setting, and it's about $200 to prescribe burn an acre. So it's very cost effective, once you get around liability and other risks associated with it. But I just wanted to put that out there because a lot of people are asking, like, how much is it? What is the most cost effective approach to dealing with wildfire? And I would say that the science is in and the numbers are in on that one.
Great, thank you. We're able to answer some of the questions in the chat as we go, which is great. And I appreciate you addressing that. We are approaching time. And so in our last 2 minutes, I want to take a nod from a question that was about hope in the chat. Is there room for hope? And this specific question was asked in the context of fire weather, but I'd like to generalize it a little bit and ask each of you if you have hope, and if so, where that hope is coming from. Angela, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think I have hope, and I think we need to have hope. From my perspective, our goal is try to mitigate as much as possible the public health impact from wildfire. And I think the hope that we're seeing is that we are recognizing the need to be prepared, and it's across the board and from different fields and different organizations that they are starting to having a plan and a better prepared. And we do have some effective solutions that can help us reduce our exposure. So I think that's the hope that I have from my perspective.
Thank you. And just in the last minute or two here, Kira, do you want to go next about hope?
Sure, I have a lot of hope. Yeah, I have 2 small children, so I got to keep the hope alive. But also, I just want to say that I'm so grateful to be learning from Indigenous fire practitioners and community members who have a wealth of expertise in fire knowledge and other ways of understanding and living with fire. And it really brings me hope because I can see many other paths forward and a lot of different ways to live safely and respectfully with fire.
Thanks, Kira. And Werner, what about you?
Yes, I do have hope. I've worked on carbon and climate for the last 40 years, and the changes I have seen in my professional career have been enormous. In the 1980s, we were still debating whether climate change is even possible as a anthropogenic consequence of anthropogenic actions. In the vast majority of scientists, this debate is long over, and we're now starting to really turn the ship around. Are we turning it around fast enough? I don't know yet, but the changes that have occurred in the last few years, whether that's technological breakthroughs in electric vehicles, just in general awareness, the notion that we put a price on carbon, the fact that governments commit to net zero emission pathways. Even 5 years ago, those things would have been very, very difficult to conceive. And to bring it back to where we started, I'm really hopeful that in Glasgow next week, government leaders will make commitments and follow through with these. And where I'm really hopeful is the Greta Thunbergs and some of the other young generation that are pushing and holding accountable policymakers to follow through on the commitments that they're making. I think we see these commitments now enshrined in laws in a number of countries, including Canada, and I remain hopeful that things will continue to improve as we go forward, despite the worsening impacts of climate change.
Thanks for those thoughts and perspectives, everyone. I'd like to take a moment to thank all three of our panelists for their time and their insight as part of this panel. In a non-COVID time, we'd have applause, but instead we can just take a moment to recognize you and the work that you contributed to this panel. For those who are in attendance this evening, if you have questions or want further information, please visit the PICS website, pics.uvic.ca. There's more information about the Wildfire and Carbon Project, as well as other resources that you can use to learn about climate solutions and more about COP26 as well. Thank you everyone for your engagement this evening. We really appreciate your attendance and your interest in this critical issue. Best of luck and stay safe.
Thanks, Carly.
Thank you.
Thank you.